Secretary of State for Health is due to give an oral statement to Parliament in response to Kate Lampard's report later today. We will video link live from here so you can see and hear it. If you have any questions with regards to the Department of Health's response to today's publications, please speak to a DH press officer after the conferences. So to start the first part of our press conference, focusing on the independent report about Stoke Mandeville Hospital, which is part of Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrula Johnstone. Dr. Johnstone is the Chief Executive of the Health and Social Care Advisory Service. She is the lead independent investigator and will present the findings of her investigation into Jimmy Savile's activities at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. Hattie Llewellyn-Davies is the Chair of Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust, and she will make a short statement in response. And Dr. Tina Kenny is the Medical Director at Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust, and she is available to take media questions. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Johnstone.
Good morning. Before I set out an overview of the findings, the investigation would like to extend its sincere thanks to the people who have come forward to talk about the sexual abuse they experienced during encounters with Savile at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. These individuals are entitled to an explanation about what happened to them that is both clear and candid. Today is about providing that explanation. The investigation was complex, and the challenges when conducting an investigation into incidents that happened up to 47 years ago were manifold. Many of the individuals we wished to interview are dead, and many others are now in extreme old age. The challenges were compounded by the fact that many of the victims, who were children at the time, had a limited recall of events. During the course of the investigation, we located over 250,000 pages of documentation and identified 355 witnesses. The main areas of our focus were: what happened? Why were these events allowed to happen? And could the same events happen again? So what happened? First, between 1968 and 1992, Savile sexually abused 60 individuals connected with Stoke Mandeville Hospital. The victims were patients, staff, visitors, volunteers, and charity fundraisers. Savile's victims ranged in age from 8 to 40, almost half under 16, with 10 being under the age of 12. Around 1/3 of his attacks were against patients. Just over 90% of the victims were female. The sexual abuse ranged from inappropriate touching to rape. Savile was an opportunistic predator who could also, on occasions, show a high degree of premeditation when planning attacks on his victims. Between 1972 and 1985, 9 informal verbal reports were made about the abuse by his victims, and in addition, 1 formal complaint was made. The investigation found that none of the informal complaints were either taken seriously or escalated to senior management. The 1 formal complaint was dropped by the complainant's father due to her serious ill health. The individuals to whom these incidents were reported failed in their duty to protect. Consequently, no intelligence about Savile's behaviour was gathered over the years and no action was taken. Whilst witnesses told us that it was an open secret within the hospital that Savile was a lecher and a general nuisance, none stated that they knew about his sexual abuse activities. Second, in 1980, Savile was appointed by ministers from the new Thatcher government and the Department of Health and Social Security as lead fundraiser and commissioning and project manager for the rebuilding of the National Spinal Injuries Centre via an independent charitable fund. This was part of a drive at the time to bring in external funding for the NHS. The then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, sponsored Savile in this role, and £500,000 of Department of Health and Social Security funding was made available to the charitable trust. There were no adequate financial forecasts in place, and from the outset the new centre was rendered dependent upon Savile's charitable fundraising for the best part of the next 2 decades. This placed him in a position of authority and power. He treated the money raised by the general public for Stoke Mandeville Hospital as his own personal largesse, and he became an increasingly disruptive and negative force. This was to lead to a decade of bitter legal wrangling in the 1990s, when officers from the newly established Stoke Mandeville NHS Trust Board challenged Savile hard using Queen's Counsel to displace the authority that had been given to him a decade earlier. Relationships underwent a total breakdown during this period. It is no coincidence that Savile's offending behaviour at the hospital appears to stop from this time. So how was this allowed to happen? In 1969, Savile came to Stoke Mandeville Hospital as a voluntary porter. He was appointed with no checks, monitoring or supervision. He was given accommodation on the hospital site and had 24-hour, 7-day-a-week access to all parts of the hospital building complex. From an early stage, his disruptive behaviour and constant sexual innuendo caused annoyance and distress to the junior staff within the hospital. However, his behaviour was explained away as being part of his eccentric celebrity persona. Savile was feted by senior managers as an important asset to the organisation, where he was quickly established as an integral part of hospital life. It would appear that at no stage were senior managers made aware of either his sexual offending or his unsatisfactory portering performance and poor moral behaviour. Adherence to policy frameworks was poor, leadership was weak, and supervision and monitoring processes in relation to Savile were absent. In 1980, when Savile was appointed by senior politicians and department officials, regulatory checks and balances were not put into place. Statutory functions were placed in the hands of a celebrity fundraiser, and this meant that department and NHS officials lost control of the Spinal Injuries Centre project. This was remiss. A major fundraising appeal was set up outside of contemporaneous NHS charity guidance. There were 2 major consequences. First, there was an ongoing dependence upon Savile's charitable funds, which ensured his continued position of power and influence at the hospital, which was often detrimental to service management. And second, Savile was able to access a new cohort of victims for his sexual abuse in the guise of young charity fundraisers to the hospital. Savile's access as a voluntary porter in the 1970s and his position of authority in the 1980s established him as a powerful and influential figure at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, one who could abuse and one whose victims felt powerless to challenge or report. So could it happen again? The newly appointed Stoke Mandeville Hospital NHS Trust Board tackled Savile head-on from 1991, and whilst it was to take several years, was able to control Savile and diminish his authority. The placing of statutory powers at local service provider level for the first time allowed the NHS Trust to address what had become an unworkable situation. At the same time, the hospital introduced more restrictions and robust processes, thanks in part to clear and unambiguous national guidance on procedures for complaints, whistleblowing, security, staff checks and volunteering. These factors combined to create a climate that was no longer conducive to a continuation of either Savile's managerial authority or his opportunistic sexual abuse. The current Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust has undergone a stringent process of review and investigation over the past 2 years in relation to safeguarding and governance from independent external agencies and this investigation to ensure that its processes are fit for purpose and provides a safe environment for patients, staff and visitors. To conclude, it must be noted that all NHS services should be alert to predatory sexual offenders like Savile, who can be placed in a position of trust and authority. Individuals like Savile operate covertly and use their influence to further their own ends in such a manner that may not be immediately obvious to those around them. Policies, statutory frameworks and safeguards are in place nationally to protect society's children and vulnerable adults. All workers in the NHS and all other responsible agencies have a duty to ensure these are adhered to at all times. The failure to do so could lead to a similar situation happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnstone. I'd like to ask Hattie Llewellyn-Davies to respond on behalf of the Trust.
Thank you. This is the third of 3 major reports into the activities of Jimmy Savile within the National Health Service. In some respects, it's similar to the reports into Savile's activities in Leeds and Broadmoor that were published last year. It contains the horrific and deeply distressing accounts of some 60 people who were abused by Savile. Their pain and their anguish floods across every page of this report and is matched only by their courage and their resolution in coming forward to tell their story. Together, these accounts paint a bleak picture of a deeply flawed and repellent individual who used his role as a fundraiser, his celebrity status and his national contacts to conceal his wicked activities. For too long, people were taken in by this controlling and manipulative man. But this report differs from the other Savile reports in that it deals exclusively with abuse that happened in the distant past. The first victim account in the report dates back to 1968, and the last is dated 1992. These awful events took place between 25 and 50 years ago. It would be wrong, however, to think that that diminishes their importance or their impact. So on behalf of the NHS organisations that existed at that time and those that exist now, I would like to say sorry to all of Jimmy Savile's victims. I know how difficult it must have been for you to come forward and tell your stories after such a long time. In addition to examining Savile's activities at Stoke Mandeville, this investigation was also tasked with considering whether our current safeguarding, whistleblowing, complaints and other policies and practices are fit for purpose. Today, Stoke Mandeville is a very different place. The investigation says that now the Trust has a safeguarding team of experienced and qualified staff members who are fully aware of the importance of safeguarding, and it has not found any safeguarding-related situation where either children or vulnerable adults have been at risk. The report states that the Trust has a comprehensive set of evidence-based, fit-for-purpose policies and procedures, and it concludes that at the present time, safeguarding processes are appropriate, and the safety of both children and vulnerable adults is not thought to be at risk. All of this is encouraging, but as the Trust Chair, I would be failing in my duty if I allowed any sense of complacency to set in. We have made real improvements. We have developed a culture of openness, of transparency and engagement. We encourage our staff to speak out when they see practice that falls below acceptable standards. We will continue to support the people who were abused by Savile. We owe it to them that we continue to listen and learn, that we remain constantly vigilant, and that we continue to improve our services. And I promise, on behalf of the Trust, that we will do just that. The ultimate responsibility for the shocking activities of Jimmy Savile must rest with the man himself. but that doesn't absolve anyone from learning the lessons that emerge from this important report. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now open the floor for questions, but just before I do that, please can you note a couple of things. The panel members can only speak about their own roles and responsibilities, so please direct your question to the most appropriate person. Also, the panel members on the stage at the moment are not experts on Kate Lampard's report, so if you have questions for Kate, please do save those for the second half of our press conference. And please could you also clearly give your name and the media outlet you're representing before you ask your question.
Mark Luke Thomas from ITV. 8 victims report. There's 2 sisters, there's a manager, there's a middle manager, and there was also a memo in 1973 with regards to his behaviour. Yet your report sets out right from the very beginning that not a single person in senior management had that knowledge. It was escalated to them. Firstly, why do you define the difference between senior management and middle management? And actually what you should have been saying is that you had no evidence to suggest that senior managers knew, but you did have evidence that said that middle managers knew.
That's exactly what we say in the report.
Well, in terms of the senior management, what's the difference between senior management and middle management? Why don't you name any middle
We do.
And
The issue here is that we can only go so far as the evidence takes us. Now, no witness and very few victims came forward with names. So there we have a handful of names, and most of the victims that came forward with names were children at the time. And one of the difficulties we've had is they couldn't actually remember the proper name. So we've had, for instance, with one person, 3 suggested similar sounding names. So what we have done is we have tried to trace all of those people through the pensions agencies, the regulatory bodies. We've done an extensive search of documentation. Where we could trace people, we interviewed them, but from what we could see, all of these individuals are dead. Now, in the 1970s, anybody in middle management, senior sisters, were probably in their 30s, 40s and 50s at the time. And so those cases belonging to the 70s took place over 40 years ago. Most of these people, from what we can see, are dead. We do criticise, we do name where we have names. And even though we are convinced, based on the evidence, that the senior top tier didn't know, we are quite harsh in our criticism that Savile should not have been allowed at Stoke Mandeville in the first place. He should never have been given the run of the hospital. The hospital did have clear policies, clear guidance, which for whatever reason were waved to one side. We name and we criticise middle managers where we have the names. We name and criticise senior managers. Whether they knew of the abuse or not is rather a side issue. They allowed this situation to happen on their watch, and they put aside policy and frameworks that could have apprehended and controlled him.
Just finally, would you accept that whilst you're saying you named people, actually you've named very few, if you're saying you don't know the names, the public would say actually nobody has been held to account for the failings of Stoke Mandeville. Would you accept that?
No, I wouldn't accept that. We have named the hospital administrators and senior managers both at district and hospital level. And for the 1970s, we clearly place accountability at their door. Whether they knew or not, they had a duty to protect, and they failed in that duty.
Okay, I'm just going to move us on to some other questions.
From The Guardian, you say, sorry, this is to Hattie Llewellyn-Davis. You say you're continuing to support the people who are abused by Savile. Are you fighting compensation claims, or have you paid out compensation? Because you do admit that the patients were not kept safe, and that was your duty to keep them safe.
The compensation issue is one that's being handled entirely by the Department of Health, and they're handling the claims across all of the Savile investigations. So it's not for us to have any involvement with it.
Are you supporting the victims in any other way?
We are indeed supporting the victims, yes. Dr. Kenny.
Perhaps I could help you with that one. There are a number of different ways that the victims can access support. One of the key and principal ways is to link with Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, who are providing them support. We've also accessed support through South East Advocacy Project and victim support as well.
Okay. Could you just wait for a microphone if you do want to ask a question, please? So it's right in the middle here.
Josh Halliday from The Guardian. This is for Dr. Johnston. You say in the report that the new NHS Trust Board tackled Savile head-on in 1991. I wondered what information prompted them to tackle him head-on if no senior managers were aware of his actions.
They didn't tackle him head-on in regard to the abuse because they didn't know about the abuse. That section is looking at his authority and control over the Spinal Injuries Centre and this large sum of money that he had hoarded. So the new trust board, made up of new individuals, power now placed at a local level for the first time, asked the questions that any statutory board should ask. What is this man doing in our hospital, and how much money does he hold in our name?
Okay, lady in the red coat.
Hello, Rachel Younger, ITV News. Another question,
Rachel,
actually.
sorry, could you just really speak into the mic? It's just quite hard to hear.
Rachel Younger from ITV News. Another question for Dr. Johnston. You talk about senior hierarchy not knowing what Savile was doing, despite the fact that middle management and junior staff did. But it went beyond that, didn't it? It was more than not knowing. It was also instilling fear in staff. We heard one senior nursing officer sent out reporting him. Isn't it the case that actually those fairly senior in the hospital were reprimanding staff when they tried to raise concerns?
We need to be careful not to make assumptions. That individual was actually a lady and she was an occupational therapist and she reported it to her supervisor. She reported it up. But in the scheme of things, when you're looking at a very, very large organisation, there are lots of people in middle management. What we found with Stoke Mandeville was it was more like a small town than a department, and that is why it's important to note the weakness of the very senior management in that there was no corporate overview, and each department was able to manage their affairs in the way that they saw fit.
But would you agree that senior staff, according to the evidence here, were too scared to speak up?
No, I don't think that is the main reason. There was, in the 1970s, a general culture of sexual misconduct and misbehaving. We've heard from a lot of victims that at the time they actually saw a great deal of this to be quite normal. Also, there's the issue about people not being believed. So I think we must resist the temptation to think it was bullying and covering up. There was just a general disbelief and also an inaction.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, front here.
Mark Easton from the BBC. I'm interested in at the beginning of your remarks, you talked about the sort of culture in national government, the determination to increase the amount of sort of charitable fundraising to keep the spinal units open. And I'm interested to what extent you think that ministers, senior civil servants, you list memos and conversations and recollections of meetings at the time in the department and elsewhere, actually helped facilitate Jimmy Savile's activities at Stoke Mandeville?
None of those people were aware of his sexual abuse, but absolutely, he now had endorsement from the very highest level of society.
And was that critical, in your view, for allowing this to happen?
Absolutely, yes. They were remiss. They were remiss.
You're talking about government ministers here, Patrick Jenkins, Gerald Vaughan.
We don't criticise Patrick Jenkins. We do criticise other ministers, and we do criticise Department of Health officials.
What about the health minister at the time, Gerald Vaughan?
Yes.
You criticise him?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the question. Here.
Chris Green with Daily Mail. How much did this inquiry cost?
I think that's going to have to be a question for others that aren't at the table here for the Department of Health, please. They're just behind you at the back.
A question for Dr. Johnston.
Sorry, could you just say where you're from, please?
Oh, yes, from the Press Association. You just mentioned that none of the MPs were actually aware of the abuse. How do you know that for sure? I mean, there's no evidence, but surely they must have heard rumours.
Well, when we're talking about misconduct and just general poor levels of behaviour, that was an open secret. But we heard that there are an awful lot of people in the hospital that behaved like that. The actual abuse, we only have 10 reports from victims, most of them in the 1970s, and they didn't get escalated. Also, we have to remember that not all of these victims actually said what happened to them. One, for instance, said, "I don't like Savile anymore." Now, maybe in a more enlightened age, we would instantly be on the alert for what that actually could mean. But no, from the evidence we have, that wasn't escalated up.
Probably a question.
Sorry, would you mind just waiting for the mic so that everybody...
Probably a question to the Chair of Buckinghamshire. The report goes into the fact that over 4 decades, 3 separate doctors at Stoke Mandeville had abused people who were at the hospital in very, very serious circumstances, and the most recent being 2002. That's a really bad indictment on the health authority in respect of what was going on. So we don't just have Savile here, we have 3 other doctors given authority in Stoke Mandeville. What was going on?
I'm afraid that's actually a question for Dr. Johnston.
Well, we do know of these doctors, and obviously with Michael Salmon recently reported in the press. It would appear that up until the sort of 1990s, systems were very weak. Now, with 2 of those doctors, they were apprehended very, very quickly. And so, whilst it's regrettable that that took place in the first place, they were apprehended. 2 of those doctors didn't have sort of decades of abuse.
How do you know that?
Well, they were prosecuted, and they were fairly young doctors, actually.
Right.
So,
So they
were prosecuted, and they were apprehended by the trust, and they were prosecuted.
Sorry, just to get to the crux of it though, but surely that's a real worry. You've got a hospital where it has the most vulnerable people, yet you have 4 doctors in 4 decades who have abused patients. That is a really bad indictment, not just on Stoke Mandeville, but surely on Buckinghamshire Health Authority.
Well, I asked that question of regulators to see whether Stoke Mandeville actually laid outside of what would be expected. And what I was told is that nobody actually keeps that data. So nobody would know. And I think you raise a very good point. But from where we were working, we don't know, regrettably, if that is usual or not. But one of the things that Stoke Mandeville has done is kept a very detailed log of any HR complaints back from round about 2002, 2003. They've obviously become far more aware. Now, not triggered by Savile, but I think from these other 2 doctors. So there is a clear evidence trail that whilst they may not always manage everything perfectly in the early 2000s, that they were more aware. So the fact that we could access all of those complaints made me convinced that they were at least trying to be on top of it.
Okay, Sandra, and then Sandra, sorry, would you mind just waiting for the mic so that everyone can...
So did you just say nobody keeps those figures across the NHS of doctors abusing patients?
We asked regulators about whether that was hospital specific, whether the GMC, the NMC, the Royal Colleges could actually give us some figures as to, were there hospital black spots? Because that's one of the first things I did, was to see if there was intelligence about Stoke Mandeville that would make it some kind of outlier. But there doesn't seem to be collated anywhere data of that sort.
Isn't that rather shocking, given the activities of Savile, and shouldn't that be changed?
Well, I mean, I found it surprising. So it is one of those areas that perhaps could do with pulling together.
And the actual question I was going to ask was, are you concerned with, we live in a very similar time, we've got a government seeking external funding for the NHS, that is being driven through. Are you concerned? I know you're saying that you've checked, no, there have been no children put at risk, but we're going to have different groups, different companies coming into the NHS. Surely that opens the risk of the wrong people getting into the system.
I think I have to come back to the conclusion from the press statement that policies and frameworks must be adhered to. The risk with Savile wasn't so much that additional funding was sought or that he was a volunteer. The difficulty came that policy and safeguarding processes were placed to one side.
Okay, there's a question in the middle, at the side and at the front. And then to you.
Victoria MacDonald from Channel 4 News. Given that so much of this was historic, the victims that you spoke to, do you get a feeling that they have any sense of release, of finally being listened to? Did it help them in any way, given that nobody really has been held to account for this?
An investigation of this sort hopefully can support in changing the culture nationally, but for the individual victims, most of those men and women that we met with weren't seeking revenge in any shape or form. They just wanted to understand what had happened to them and why at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. For the first time, many of these individuals spoke out loud about what had happened, and I hope that today will give them some of the answers that they have been waiting for.
Okay, there's a question just at the side. Yeah.
Thank you. Tom Swarbrick from LBC Radio. You talk about the building blocks of legislation, policy and procedure not being followed or adhered to. To what extent then do you think that this report looks at mandatory reporting and the need for that to put a legal precedent on having to follow those procedures and policies and to prosecute those who ignore it and wave the abuse through?
I think mandatory reporting is an issue for the government, not for me. But if people don't follow the policies and guidance that are already there, then we have to think carefully about how making that a statutory requirement would actually improve things.
Question at the front, please.
Andy Gardner, freelance. I'd like to link it into an earlier question about the future shape of the NHS and in fact what we're seeing now. It's quite clearly stated in your reports and other reports that the volunteer base is increasing and the government or governments are using these people to actually sort of work in different areas of the NHS on a more sort of extended basis. Do you believe that the procedures and policies in place are adequate? Because in this report you seem to be saying that there are areas which could be improved, so that would tend to suggest that there might be issues with regards to vetting volunteers or whatever.
Can I refer you to Kate Lampard, who'll be talking to you shortly, because I know that Kate goes into this in a great deal of detail.
Sorry, of course, but you commented on the previous question, so you must, and you findings and years, you must review it.
I know that Kate will be addressing all of that in a great deal of detail and will be able to address that better than me.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Hi, Julian Drucker, 5 News. Can you say any more about Savile being interviewed on the premises, which is a matter of record in 2009? It just seems inconceivable. This was just 6 years ago. It seems inconceivable that staff apparently didn't even know that that was happening.
No, they didn't, and it's not inconceivable at all, because Savile did on occasions come to the hospital even in the 2000s, and he had an office there, and so he came to the hospital and the police came and interviewed him there. Nobody would check Savile coming into his office, so he was interviewed there by 2 police officers, and the police didn't alert anybody at the Trust about the interview, and Savile didn't tell anybody at the Trust about the interview either. So it was a location for the interview, and it wasn't about anything that had actually taken place at the hospital.
And right at that, please.
Hi, Noel Tetheridge, BBC. Just a question specifically about victim 21, who seems to be key to the report. A nurse, senior sister and a manager were informed of her assault. How significant is this missed opportunity, not only in Stoke Mandeville, but in stopping Savile's abuse across the country, and how shaming is it that that opportunity was lost?
We say in the report that had this complaint been managed properly, Savile would probably have been apprehended at that point. So whether the complainant's father dropped the complaint or not, all of those staff involved, whoever they were, we haven't been able to trace them, failed in their duty to protect.
Alistair Claber from Nursing Standard. There's some accounts in the report of junior nurses having raised concerns, and I wanted to ask what you'd found in terms of failings in nursing leadership. Why was the message not getting through to them?
Well, we can only speculate. We interviewed RCN stewards and nursing representatives, nursing managers, none of whom claimed to have known. They all understood that Savile was a sex pest, that he was a nuisance. It would appear that the nursing cohort of staff in each of the different departments just managed Savile and staff concerns in their own way. And from what we can see, they didn't escalate it up.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I'll just thank the panel that's currently on the stage, and we'll pause just for a couple of seconds whilst the panel switches. Okay, everybody. I'd like to start the second part of our press conference. So we're going to move on to a focus on Kate Lampard's report to the Secretary of State for Health. I'd like to introduce Kate Lampard. Kate is the independent author of this report. She is a former practicing barrister and former Deputy Chair of the Financial Ombudsman Service. Kate was appointed by the Secretary of State for Health in October 2012 to provide independent oversight and assurance of 3 independent investigations into the role and activities of Jimmy Savile in the NHS. Kate has overseen the joint Broadmoor Hospital investigation by the Department of Health and West London Mental Health Trust, and the investigations at Leeds General Infirmary and Stoke Mandeville Hospital to ensure a robust process is followed. She has also provided general oversight of the smaller investigations conducted by the relevant legacy NHS trusts. I'd also like to introduce Ed Marsden. Ed is the co-author of this report. He is the managing partner at Verita, an independent consultancy which specialises in conducting and managing investigations, reviews and inquiries for public sector and statutory organisations. I would like to invite Kate to present their report and recommendations on the lessons learnt from all the reports into Jimmy Savile's activities in the NHS, and Kate and Ed will then take questions on the findings. Kate.
Good morning, everybody. The story of Jimmy Savile's offending in NHS hospitals is unusual to the point of being scarcely credible. Savile, a flamboyantly eccentric, narcissistic and manipulative television personality, used his celebrity, his volunteering and fundraising roles to gain unprecedented access to NHS hospitals. Savile's status and influence in Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville and Broadmoor hospitals was enhanced by the endorsement and encouragement he received from politicians, senior civil servants, and NHS managers. His access within NHS hospitals gave Savile the opportunity to commit sexual abuses on a grand scale for nearly 50 years. Savile's ability to avoid being caught for so long owed much to the social attitudes of the time, including a less intrusive media, more hierarchical and fragmented hospital management structures, and significantly less public understanding and acknowledgement of sexual abuse. Nevertheless, many of the features of the Savile story have relevance and implications for today's NHS. At the heart of the concerns raised by the Savile story is the failure of NHS organisations to keep patients, visitors and staff safe. Everyone has the right to feel safe in hospital. In our report, we focus on matters that still need dealing with to protect people from the sort of abuses perpetrated by Savile. The common themes and issues that have emerged from the separate NHS investigations into Savile, which we see as relevant for the wider NHS today, are the freedom Savile had to roam around NHS hospitals, the lack of supervision of him as a volunteer, the failure of NHS hospitals to identify and manage the risks Savile presented, and to keep patients, visitors and staff safe from his abuses. The fact that concerns about Savile were not raised, or if they were not taken seriously. The inappropriate control Savile had over charitable funds, and the influence that control gave him. And finally, the part that politicians and senior civil servants played in promoting Savile. We are absolutely clear that the volunteer workforce in hospitals does wonderful work and greatly improves the experience of patients. NHS hospitals have ambitious plans to increase their volunteer numbers, and as our report shows, there are already more than 78,000 volunteers who in total contribute more than 13 million hours per year to the work of acute hospitals in England. Hospital volunteers are much younger and a more diverse population than was the case in Savile's day. They undertake a much wider variety of roles and often have much closer contact with patients than in the past. Volunteers befriend and advise patients. They read to them and help them to eat. They cuddle babies. But our investigations disclosed that many NHS volunteer programmes are not managed and overseen at a senior level and do not have the management resources they need. This poses a potential risk to patients, their visitors, and staff. We make recommendations aimed at improving the management of volunteer schemes in the NHS and ensuring that volunteers enjoy the support and public confidence they deserve. Many NHS hospital managers and staff welcomed Savile for his status as a celebrity and fundraiser. They hoped he would boost staff and patient morale, raise the profile of their organisations, and raise funds for them. But his status as a celebrity and fundraiser, whose presence had been encouraged by senior managers, meant that staff who observed him behaving inappropriately or who received reports of him committing sexual abuses were reluctant to challenge Savile directly or to escalate matters to senior managers. Our investigations suggest that most NHS organisations still do not have adequately explicit and robust processes for managing their relationships with celebrities, important visitors, fundraisers and donors. There is a need, and we make a recommendation, for all NHS hospitals to have and to implement a robust policy for agreeing to and managing visits by celebrities and important visitors, including the need for such visits and visitors to be accompanied at all times. Such policy should be applied to all visits by celebrities and important visitors, whoever they may be. In our report, we consider the efficacy of current safeguarding arrangements in NHS hospitals, particularly in relation to matters of abuse. We found that awareness of safeguarding in NHS hospitals has improved in recent years in the wake of recent abuse scandals. However, we identify a number of specific safeguarding risks that came to light during our investigations. These include the fact that hospitals are not able, under present regulations, to undertake barring list checks on all their staff and volunteers. There are inconsistent HR processes within some organisations, and there are inadequate policies to protect people in hospitals, particularly young people, from inappropriate use of the internet and social media, including grooming. But the clear message that we have taken from the Savile story and from our investigations is that safeguarding and the prevention of further Savile-like cases rests above all on training and retraining staff on how to create a safe environment and to identify and act upon signs of risk. It depends too on staff, patients, visitors, indeed each of us, having the sense and the courage to fulfill our duty as citizens to speak up about matters of concern and challenge inappropriate behaviours. Our report is, of course, only one of a number that have been commissioned into recent allegations of sexual abuse and the handling of them by public bodies. We have endeavoured to share our thinking and our findings with those who have undertaken or are undertaking such other investigations. We hope to continue to engage with them in order to ensure a coherent and effective response to all issues of abuse being examined. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'd like to now open the floor for questions. Just as a reminder, please give your full name and the media outlet you represent, and please do wait for a microphone so that everybody can hear your question. Mark, starting with you.
Thanks very much. Mark Easton from the BBC. You mention in the observance of due process and good governance part of your report that ministers and/or senior civil servants overrode or failed to observe accepted governance processes in the promotion of Savile as the sort of poster boy of fundraising within the NHS. And I just really wanted your thoughts on to what extent that political climate at the time, the need to have somebody who could be used to change the culture of third sector funding of health service, allowed Savile to abuse his position.
I mean, I think it's quite clear, particularly from the Stoke Mandeville report, that Savile was given carte blanche to manage the building of the National Spinal Injuries Centre in total disregard to the processes that were in place at the time, even for the appointment of people to manage affairs within NHS hospitals, and indeed for the procurement regulations there were at the time. I think that gave Savile a degree of authority, a degree of power, which he then was able to use for continuing to promote himself within that hospital, and which undermined people's capacity to challenge him. So to that extent, yes, I do think it added to his abusive behaviour.
What about the safeguarding side? Do you think that safeguarding processes, as well as the sort of normal rules on who can raise money and that kind of thing, were overridden from the top?
I think that it's quite difficult to be quite so certain about safeguarding policies and procedures that were in place at the time. It's evident from our investigations that safeguarding has come a long way since then. to the extent that there should have been processes to tackle anybody who might be a risk within the organisation. It's clear from certainly Dr. Johnston's report that nobody did anything about those matters, and Savile benefited from that.
Okay, now come to Victoria.
Victoria MacDonald from Channel 4 News. You say here that your investigation suggests that most NHS organisations still don't have adequately explicit and robust processes for managing celebrities and so on. Have any of them given you an explanation, given how long this has been going on, why they still don't have that?
I'm sorry to say that when we challenged some organisations about why they did not have a policy for the management of visits by celebrities, their invariable answer was, well, we don't get visits from celebrities, nobody's interested in us. And it strikes me that those are indeed exactly the sorts of organisations that are likely to mismanage their relationships with celebrities and need those policies in place to support staff to deal with visits properly.
It is worth adding, I think, that there are some hospitals that do have very well developed policies, and particularly some of the London teaching hospitals who you imagine do get both VIPs and celebrities visiting them regularly. So there's good practice out there from which organisations in the NHS could learn.
Okay, I'm going to start here and walk across. I am going to get to
Rachel Younger, ITV News. You speak, and we all know about the wonderful work volunteer workforce do in hospitals, but how much has been learned? Are there now records kept by hospitals, by trusts, when complaints are made of inappropriate behaviour?
I'm not in a position to understand exactly how many complaints have been made in NHS hospitals about volunteer work, the volunteer workforce. Our investigations suggest that there is very patchy management of volunteer schemes. We found some good practice. I'm afraid we found some poor practice and some very weak management arrangements. And in those hospitals where the management was not so good, I am not confident that they would be able to identify all anxieties there might be about volunteers.
So this could happen again?
I make recommendations in the report aimed at keeping people in hospital safe, and as part of that, I have recommended that everybody needs to revisit their management arrangements in respect of their volunteer schemes.
Okay, at the back, and then the two sides.
Thanks. Hugh Pym, BBC News. It's a point you made about checks, barring list checks. From what I'm reading the report, the bit that's relevant, are you saying that there needs to be new legislation to ensure that full enhanced checks can be carried out on all staff and volunteers, or changes to regulations?
I am saying that I think that regulations need to be changed to ensure that all volunteers and staff in NHS hospitals who come into contact with patients and their visitors should be subject to a barring list check.
But given the, as you note, the increase in demand for volunteers in many parts of the NHS, and possible delays to achieving this, it's going to take a little while, and it's raising the bar quite high and going to involve a lot of administration by hospitals if they want to take on volunteers.
I'm not so sure that that is the case. I think that the DBS scheme is now much more efficient than it used to be. Most of these people will be subject to a check. In any event, they'll be subject to a standard check or an enhanced check. And it is simply a matter of also requesting on top of that that they now be given the barring list check. I want to be absolutely clear with you. I think that the volunteer workforce is essential. I think it's doing wonderful things in NHS hospitals. But I think that we need to make sure that we maintain public confidence in that workforce, that vital resource. And to do that, we need to make sure that people are comfortable that the right people are in our hospitals volunteering.
I think it's also worth making the point that volunteers are carrying out very different types of work to, the traditional view of the volunteer in an NHS hospital, which is, behind the tea trolley or manning the cafe. They are now much more engaged in providing patient benefit, if you like.
Okay, Sandra.
Sandra from The Guardian again, sorry. I'm just interested in this mandatory reporting issue. You've stopped short, indeed said it's not appropriate to make conclusions on mandatory reporting in the context of the lessons from one particular historical sex abuse scandal. Do you not think, had there been mandatory reporting in place, he would have been stopped years and years ago, though?
I mean, that's a very interesting question because, in fact, that would suggest that the whole safeguarding system was more astute and more sophisticated than it was in those days. I'm sure that if there had been mandatory reporting, then what would be accompanying it would be a whole better system for identifying people who are a risk. So I'm not sure he'd have even got there in the first place. I'm sorry to...
If people thought that there was a criminal sanction for not reporting suspicions, would they not then refer it up to their senior managers, make sure that they'd referred it up? Would it not give whistleblowers huge protections who might be intimidated by senior managers if there's a criminal sanction for not reporting suspicions of abuse?
I'm not going to go into a hypothetical speculation about what might have happened in respect of Savile some time ago, but the evidence that we received about mandatory reporting was very divided and inconclusive. And whilst many people take your view, the view that you're suggesting, that it would necessarily improve reporting arrangements, there are others who believe that it might lead to driving things underground, and it might also lead to misreporting, which means that there is not enough attention focused on those who really do present a risk. And it is a very complicated subject. I did not feel that in the context, and Ed and I did not feel in the context of our work, it was appropriate to try to resolve such a complicated and large subject. And but I do welcome the fact that there is now going to be a serious consultation on the matter. It is overdue.
It's really a follow-up. Martin Evans from The Telegraph. It's a follow-up to the point on mandatory reporting. The opposition that you received to the suggestion of mandatory reporting, where did that come from? Did that come from NHS managers?
I think that it's mostly, I think, from practitioners, those who work with sex offenders and understand the nature of sex offending.
There's a question right at the back.
Hi, Kate. I'm not press, as you know. I'm Pete Saunders from NAPAC.
Hello.
And if you answered the question while I was out the room, sorry to ask again. Earlier, the team from Stoke Mandeville were asked about whether or not they were comfortable with the amount of support that victim survivors were receiving. And they seemed to say that they were. I'm just wondering whether you are entirely satisfied with the level of support, therapeutic support, counselling, etc., that survivors of Savile, bearing in mind that many will not have come forward, of course. I suppose you can't comment on that one. And the other sort of supplementary question is can you help us to continue to put some pressure on the Department of Health to extend services to adult survivors of childhood abuse? Because as well as the many hundreds, I would say many thousands of people that Savile abused, there are many, many thousands of others out there, I would argue millions, who are still struggling to find proper therapeutic support to help them to move on with their lives. And I thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Ed to answer the first one.
I think in the context of the investigations, both the three major investigations and the smaller investigations, at the outset there was a discussion between Kate and me and the teams about supporting victims of abuse, and I think that the way the investigations were conducted, which was locally and sensitive to people's needs, you know, was a sort of a big effort to try and you know, care for victims, and I think that those people who in the course of, you know, giving evidence clearly required more support, that was provided too. So I think from the point of view of the conduct of these investigations, you know, there was an attempt to, you know, support victims. Clearly, if people don't feel that they've been properly supported, we'd very much like to hear from them. But I think perhaps Kate could deal with the other bit of the question.
I will say that in relation to the attitude of the Department of Health, they have been extremely supportive in our endeavours to get the right support and to help the investigation teams to get the right support for the victims who came forward. I think it is an ongoing conversation that needs to be had with the department about support for victims of historic sexual abuse, and it is a matter that I will take opportunities to pursue.
Can I just ask a supplementary question with regards to mandatory reporting? You said that part of the people who came back and were negative or possibly had issues regarding mandatory reporting, a lot of those were practitioners who worked with sex abusers?
Who worked with sex abusers, or people involved in safeguarding and...
Okay, could you put a bit more detail and explain what the issues were?
No, I don't think I will. I think this is not the forum in which I ought to be discussing the intricacies of mandatory reporting, and I think that it is a subject that's going to be dealt with extensively in the consultation that's going to take place. And as I say in my report, I didn't think it was for me to come to a conclusion, and for that reason I don't think it's right that I should rehearse the arguments that were put to me.
Okay, are there any... Yes, the question.
So the same question again. How much does all of this cost?
I'm afraid that's a matter you're going to have to raise with the Department of Health.
Okay, does everybody feel they've had a chance to ask a question? I think so. We are expecting the oral statement in Parliament to be at about 11:15, and it will play from a live link here if you'd like that. I'd like to thank Kate and Ed, and thank you very much for coming today.